The Brothers Karamazov, Book 5, Chapter 4. We are right in the middle of a 3-chapter long conversation between Alyosha and Ivan. Ivan begins this chapter, Chapter 4, The Rebellion, with a comment about Christian love. Ivan says that love is impossible. He finds that it is impossible to love people. And then he gives this example of a Christian saint who took in a poor and cold man and held him close at night because of how cold he was and how poor he was. He couldn't warm himself. And so this Christian saint held him tight, and then seeing that that wasn't good enough, he breathed warm air into this filthy, putrid, disgusting, diseased mouth person. And Ivan looks at a story like that and he interprets it with his worldview and says, I don't see that as possible. I think that there is no such thing as love like that. The love of Christ is a supernatural thing, and I don't have access to that. I am a natural man. I can love ideas, and I can love the idea of love, but when it comes close, when it comes near me, I can't love particular people. So therefore, I interpret this story of the saint. The only thing I can interpret from it, says Ivan, is that there's some selfish motive in it. There's some lack of purity to it. There's something the saint is getting personally from this. There's no such thing as altruism. Then, predictably, Alyosha responds, no, I think that there's something very near Christian love. There's very near Christ-like love. Maybe love isn't perfect, but I've experienced love like that. And so a sharp disagreement there. Then Ivan says, well, here, let me just give it to you. Let me just tell you what it is that I believe, and more particularly, what I don't believe. And he says, listen, I'll give you my argument, and I'll tie 9 of 10 hands behind my back. I'll just limit, and therefore by limiting, weaken my argument by 90%. Let's merely talk about the suffering of the innocent children. Let's limit my argument to only people who don't deserve their suffering. Adults, any story you can tell about an innocent adult suffering, the comeback can always be that they somehow deserved what happened to them. And so we can't say that about children. Children did nothing to inherit the sin of their fathers. Children did nothing. They are by nature, they are victims. And so then Ivan unleashes 5 of the most horrific stories that you've ever heard. The first one is about Turks who throw babies up in the air and then they land on their bayonets. Turks who nail prisoners' ears to the wall the day before they're going to kill them. Turks who get a baby to play with them, and then as the baby grabs for the gun, they shoot the baby and the baby's brains fly out. He tells this long story about a boy named Richard whose parents sold him to shepherds, and the shepherds looked at him as property, not as person, and they treated him as such. Then he runs away when he's old enough to Geneva, and the only life skill he has is theft. He's caught for his theft. In prison, Christian pastors and missionaries minister to him. He finds Jesus, finds forgiveness, and then they decapitate their Christian brother right after celebrating how great it was that his sins were forgiven. These Christians chop off his head. So the first was the Turks. The second was the story of Richard. Then he digresses a little bit and talks about, well, those are foreign examples. We Russians have our own particular flavor of evil. Even look at how we treat horses. We make them work all day long, and then we strike them in the eyes when they can no longer comply with our commands. Then he talks about one case, but he's really using it as a symbol of much broader reality in Russia of dads who take branches of birch, particularly because of how they particularly grab into the skin. And so he talks about fathers who abuse their children. And then when they are called to give an account of their abuse, they have a defense attorney who stands up and says, listen, all fathers discipline their children. This is no different. And then the jury, the crowds all cheer when the father who is a child abuser is vindicated and acquitted. So the Turks, the story of Richard, child abuse. Then he tells an even more horrific story about a young couple who have an 8-year-old girl, and they don't abuse actively at the beginning of the story. They abuse by neglect. They leave her cold and alone outside in a Russian winter, and they sleep through her cries. And then in the most horrific thing that I can picture in my life, they smear her own excrement on her face and even in her mouth. And so at this point, as he's gone through 4 of his 5 anecdotes of a world in which, if there is a God, he's surely no good. He's assuming that there is a God and that the God is all-powerful. So he's assuming God exists, and he's assuming God could stop it. And so these examples, one after another, are asserting the problem of evil. Where is God, and why isn't he stopping these innocent children from being abused? And so he stops and he anticipates sort of a typical medieval Christian response. I know we're talking about the Orthodox Church here, but Thomas Aquinas in the Western tradition had a famous, and in my humble opinion, a famously bad explanation of evil, where he basically reasoned that we can't know what good is unless we have an evil, and so we will never appreciate good unless we have evil. And so he said evil isn't really even a thing. Evil is just a privation of the good. And so if you're talking about, stubbing your toe or the proverbial every rose has its thorn, that we can't appreciate fall until we've suffered through summer. If you're talking about banal examples like that, yes, but you can't use that as a theodicy for people walking out of a concentration camp. You can't say, well, now you know what good is because you have suffered evil. It just doesn't work. It's not a satisfactory answer. And so Ivan anticipates that might be what Alyosha's thinking. And so he says, do you want to use that defense that we know good? Because let me ask you this: is there any good? Is there any lesson that we can learn that would justify the abuse of one child, that would justify the tears of one child? If you were in charge, if you were God, would you let one child be abused so that we could all come to this knowledge of good? And Alyosha has, no real answer. He says, no, I wouldn't. So then Ivan says, well, do you want me to stop after these 4 examples? The Turks, the Richard, the dads who abuse their kids with birch branches, and the young couple who smear their daughter's own excrement in her face and in her mouth. Do you want me to stop there? And Alyosha says, no, I want to suffer. And so then he gives a last example of a 8-year-old boy who was working for a military official, and he throws a rock and hurts one of the official's hounds. And so the boy is brought out naked, and he is devoured by the hounds. And so Ivan looks at Alyosha and says, what do you think should happen to this man who let an 8-year-old boy be naked and devoured by the wolves? And Alyosha, looking at the ground, says, shoot him. And Ivan says, basically, exactly. So the devil is in you too, because that is the only sort of justice that I can endorse, is to shoot a man like that. And so that leaves Ivan now to his final tirade of the chapter, and he says, look, I know what the Christian doctrine of this is. I know that there is a future judgment. I know that God is just and he is the judge and he brings every sin to account. And I know there's a thing as hell. But my problem is, what good is that to these children? That child with excrement in her mouth, out alone, without parents, without warmth, without food, without love and compassion. What good is it to her that there is such a thing as hell? And if there is no hell and there's this heaven, everybody, all dogs go to heaven, everybody gets into heaven, then he creates sort of a satirical, mocking vision of Christian heaven, which is, okay, so this soldier who put your baby up in the air and then landed on his bayonet, well, will that mother and soldier be hugging in heaven? And if so, will the child be there with them? And so he says, listen, moms don't have the ability to forgive. They can forgive their own hurt and grief in the face of this unjust suffering. But moms have no right, dads have no right to forgive those who have brought great evil and harm on innocent sufferers. And so for Ivan, he doesn't really care if the Bible has a justice someday. He wants justice now. And he doesn't just want it. He wants to see it. He wants to experience it. He wants justice to reign right now. He doesn't want to wait for it. And so this is the most penetrating, cutting, and I think it's no accident that Dostoevsky has recently titled 2 chapters and very well could have titled 3 chapters in the previous book, A Laceration. This is a laceration to the Christian faith. This is a deep cut in the Christian faith. Ivan has laid out in the most graphic, logical, dare I say, beautiful and terrible, he's laid out the problem of evil. And the problem of evil is this, that Christians want to say that God is all-powerful, and Christians want to say that God is all-loving, and at the very same time, evil and injustice and the suffering of the innocent exist. And so the question is turned back to the Christians, which of the two would you like to give up? Is God good and just can't stop it? Or is God powerful and he's not good? And Ivan seems to go with that latter option, that God is not good enough to stop it, that God isn't love. And if he is love and he just defers his love, he defers his judgment to some future day. Ivan says, I just can't, I can't see how that could be. And you might come back, Ivan anticipates and say, you might come back at me and say, well, God's understanding is higher than yours. He sees things that you don't see. And Ivan says, well, that's a problem too, because I'm a rational creature and he created me and he should behave rationally as I see it. He should behave, this is the plane we're living on, and so he should play according to the rules of the game that he created. And so Ivan has powerfully asserted the non-Christian problem of evil. However, I think that what makes the novel so interesting is that in the previous chapter, Ivan echoed what he had already said way back in Book 2 when Pyotr had said to the monks assembled in Zosima's cell, do you know what this guy really believes? That the only basis for love is if God exists. If there is no God, then everything is permissible. That's what Pyotr had said that Ivan believed, and Ivan affirmed that it actually is his worldview. That if there is no God, you have to be honest with yourself, and the only rational response to atheism is nihilism. And so if there is no God, there is no purpose to anything, and therefore love isn't a real thing. Love is a biological response. It is something entirely arbitrary, and so are things like good and righteousness and justice and loving children and beauty and truth. All of those things are just arbitrary, made-up things. he repeated that line of thinking in the previous chapter, talking to Alyosha, saying, quoting someone who said that if there is no God, it would be necessary to invent one. Again, Alyosha hears his brother giving the Christian problem of evil. The Christian problem of evil as they look at unbelievers. So Christian people hear the problem of evil and say, okay, that is a difficult concept to reckon with. How can God be all-powerful, all-loving, and yet evil still exists? But then the Christian looks back at the unbeliever and says, but I don't see what you gain very much by that, because you have an equally, and in the thesis of this book, more than equally difficult problem, and that is all of those 5 terrible atrocities that Ivan listed to Alyosha, you have no category for calling those evil. Your judgment about that is just merely your opinion or your society's opinion. It has no weight. It has no universality. It doesn't come from anything. If we are all just biological accidents here, then any sort of talk of righteousness or justice or innocence or evil or bayonets or excrement, all of those things are just completely arbitrary. And so in an intellectual way, Ivan has articulated in 2 consecutive chapters that no matter what your worldview is, you have a rationality problem. You've got some explaining to do. Do you want to be a Christian and appeal to mystery and say, I don't know how those 2 things can coexist, but they do. I don't know how evil and a sovereign, loving God can coexist, but they do. Or do you want to be an unbeliever and say, I have no rational basis for calling something evil, yet I'm going to just keep asserting that there is a universal morality, that there is meaning in life, that there is truth and justice and righteousness, even though I know darn well that I have no reason to use words like that they are utterly meaningless in an ultimately nihilistic universe. And I can, as some absurdist or existentialist, I can come back and say, well, no, the point of life is that you create your own meaning. But Ivan is too honest for that kind of response and say, but if you've created your own meaning, then you by nature of saying that, you have admitted that there is no inherent meaning, that all meaning in life is just created. It's not derived. So that's where Ivan is rationally, but I think he also has a personal problem with this, because he looks at, he begins the chapter by telling the story of this Christian ideal of love, and he's saying that he's not capable of loving anyone like that. And furthermore, he says, I don't think other people are capable of it either. I think everyone has selfish motives. And what's the last thing that's just happened to Ivan? Well, Katerina has said that she can't love him, even though she probably actually does love him, because out of duty, she's going to love Dmitri. And so probably ringing around Ivan's head is that exact image of love. That it's just the Christian love for Ivan is completely arbitrary and dutiful, like Katerina's love for Dmitri. She's just doing it for some reason to justify, to glorify herself. It's not actually loving Dmitri like Christ would love him. Katerina just has some arbitrary motive for it. And so besides the intellectual bind that Ivan is in, he's also got that going. And what has he just done the night before? Well, he's seen the scene with his father. And what is his father? Well, he is Ivan's worldview drawn to its logical conclusion. How can you condemn any of Fyodor's vices? His drunkenness, his lies, his meanness, his debauchery, his wickedness. How can you condemn your own father? He's so annoying to live with that's actually why you're in this tavern. You've just admitted this to Alyosha. Our dad is so annoying that I left a free meal to come and pay for a meal at this tavern just because I can't stand to be around him anymore. And so Ivan says, I can't love particular people. People are disgusting. I can only love the concept of love, but I don't really believe in it. I've got a problem of evil, but everybody's got a problem of evil. But I can't believe in a God who would let these innocent children suffer. And yet, if I follow my worldview logically and consistently, look at the two yuckiest people, Katerina and Fyodor. That's where my worldview takes me. But Alyosha has yet to really respond in this chapter. At the very end of the chapter, we get Alyosha starting to respond with the classic Christian response, which is this. You are not talking about the God of every other religion. You're talking about the Christian God. And what is unique about the Christian God? Christmas and Good Friday and everything that came in between. God is not the God of Bette Midler from a distance. God is the God of Christmas and the Christian worldview. And he came down and was born in a feed bin to poor parents. He was alone and poor and humble in a no-account town his entire life, and then he died on a cross. And so Christmas and Good Friday and Easter, they don't intellectually solve the problem of evil, but what do? They practically take care of the problem of evil. Does God know what it's like for an innocent to suffer? Yes, because he is an innocent sufferer. Is God doing anything about suffering? Yes, he went to the cross for suffering. Will the bad guys win? No. Christ was resurrected over sin and death, and he will return to judge the living and the dead. And so Alyosha begins to bring out this Christian argument that an aloof God, that criticism cannot be sustained when you're talking about the Christian faith. And Ivan cuts, Ivan's intelligent, and Ivan cuts Alyosha off and says, no. I know what you're going to say, and I'm surprised you haven't brought him before now, which leads into the next chapter in the Grand Inquisitor. One feels weird to call it interesting, but I can't think of another word. One interesting note is that in Dostoevsky's letters, this one happens to be numbered letter 782. He's writing to the editors, the people who publish, actually the brothers K, the second magazine that this book was published periodically. He wrote to the editors and said, please understand when I submit this chapter, please understand what I'm doing. I'm not going out of my way to be grotesque by these 5 examples that Ivan gives Alyosha. In fact, in my time as a reporter, in my time reading religious tracts, in my time reading religious lives of saints and lives of warriors, all 5 of these stories are actually true. And so I have not embellished, and I can give you my sources. And so that makes Ivan's argument against the Christian God and Ivan's problem with justice that much more effective when we can go back and reread this chapter with those eyes, that Ivan's stories are not part of the fictional world of the Karamazovs. These are things that happened in real time in space. And so Dostoevsky tells his editor, listen, I have to give this new atheism, this new socialism that is taking hold in the youth all throughout Russia. I need to give them the exact opposite of a straw man. I need to present their argument better than they can present it, so that in the subsequent chapters and throughout the rest of the book, when if I can successfully show where their worldview is lacking, then it'll have the most effect. So Dostoevsky's letter 782 kind of explains both the background of this chapter, but also sort of the strategy, what Dostoevsky was doing. whatever the opposite of a straw man may be a strong man. He looks at the new atheism and he says, I want to articulate every problem they have with Christianity, and I want to do it better than I've seen them do.